This morning here in the UK, the political narrative very much dominated by the speech the Prime Minister has delivered on the future for the UK in the post-Brexit world. We've also seen a similar speech delivered by Michel Barnier. What is your assessment of how the economic landscape is going to change now, and do you see opportunities here in the UK?
I think that there are beginning to be opportunities in the UK. I mean, a lot of it is about where the pricing is. The reality of Brexit is there are going to be winners and losers, which the government has admitted. The question is how big the winners and losers will be. And my concern is if Europe decides that they're going to have all regulation tied to the UK, or it's not going to happen. So in other words, they say, fine, we're not going to just talk about fisheries, but we're also going to talk about service industry. So yes, if you don't want to go with us on fisheries, we're not going to take your service industry. That could be completely disastrous because when you look at the GDP part of the economy, which is service export into Europe, it would be devastating for the UK.
How much is this affecting your thinking in terms of where you're looking to make investments?
We're being very careful when it comes to certain types of real estate asset because the City of London would be the big loser, huge loser. And we already are using European law firms on quite a lot of the deals we do in the continent rather than using UK law firms. And frankly, it's easier, it's local, and the big concern to us is whether a European court is going to be willing to enforce English law.
Do you see it being able to happen quite quickly? Say the UK finance industry were to lose out, how easy would the shift be for business to go from London, which does still have a lot of infrastructure around the finance industry here, you talk about the legal aspects of that, to move that onto the continent? How straightforward would that be in your mind?
I think it'd be very, very quick. It's not going to happen in 12 months, but it certainly could happen within 5 years. And it's a very, very easy thing for the Europeans to do. They just simply say that European companies wanting to borrow or deals in Europe have to be done under European law, not English law.
So just to return to the opportunities, if there were to be a reasonably smooth process, if this were to happen on a relatively easy basis, the regulatory divergence wasn't that great, do UK assets look good value at the moment? Yes.
I mean, if it happens smoothly, they look very good value. But interestingly, there are opportunities in the UK, even if it didn't happen smoothly. One of the things which is going to be interesting is food prices will definitely go up. And you could, depending on what the UK does with the rest of the world, have a real re-establishment of local quality food, simply because we won't be able to get the cheaper food from Europe. The Guernsey, for example, lost its entire tomato business when we entered the European Union. All of a sudden, if you can't buy cheap tomatoes from Europe and other countries, you've got a chance to start growing them locally. However, that depends on the trade deals that the UK does with the rest of the world. And the risk is we end up doing trade deals with the rest of the world, which allows us to take in goods which are very, very cheap from the rest of the world. Yep. We can't export the goods which we have a huge added value on into Europe, and we get the worst of both worlds.
Are you positioning for this?
For the most part, I'm only investing in Europe at the moment and not in the UK. So to some extent, I'm just being defensive until I see what happens.
Looking ahead to what 2020 brings, 2019, you thought about capital raising. That didn't happen. Does 2020 bring capital raising?
We're now very much focusing on doing a deal by deal. The advantage of doing deal by deal is we don't have to have a lot of capital until we have a deal we like. And what that's meant is we become, I think, a lot more selective. If you've got a 10 billion fund to invest, you've got to get it to work. You've theoretically got to do at least 2 billion each year. If you're sitting there just one deal. So last year we actually could have done 4 deals and in the end didn't do any of them.
Okay. Why not? Before this conversation started, you and I were talking off camera about ESG. How much of that was those deals you didn't do were down to ESG concerns?
Half of them were, yeah. So half of them...
So 2 of the deals...
They didn't fit into the criteria that our investors would have been happy with on an ESG basis. And frankly, I wouldn't have been happy having my name associated with them either. They could have been very profitable deals. They just didn't fit into what we think as a private equity firm one needs to do. And from an economic point of view, you look at the multiple you're going to sell the business at. And yes, maybe today you buy it at 7 times, but maybe in 5 years' time, because no one wants to touch that particular type of business, you end up selling it at 5 times.
Right. So ESG is a quite sort of senior part of your thinking, quite a high up in terms of your thinking, in terms of the deals you're doing?
The way we run our investment process is we have a meeting each week where we float the deals we're looking at. That meeting is very largely, is this a deal we want to do? Not economically, but is it a deal we want to do as a deal we feel has the right feeling to it? And that really is largely about ESG. And I would say 50% of the deals that come through that process get rejected on reputational reasons.
Just to circle back to the deal-by-deal funding that you're doing at the moment, if Brexit were to be, if a deal with the EU were to be resolved on amicable terms and the UK were to move forward, do you think the attitude towards fundraising, you raising money, would change as well? How much was Brexit to blame for your current kind of strategy towards fundraising?
I don't see the strategy we have as necessarily being a negative. I think it's actually a positive, because it means that we can concentrate on doing individual deals which give us maximum alpha. If you're doing a fund, you're having to run a portfolio, and it's a different process. And I think I'm a better investor than I am a fund manager. So from my point of view, as I put up at least 10% of every deal, and some deals it's as much as 50%, my personal focus is really, what is the return on this deal going to be? So I'm actually quite pleased not to be doing fund management at this point and being able to focus on individual deals. So sometimes, necessity is the mother of invention. I actually think where we've got to is actually a really good place. So in that point of view, I thank Brexit. What I think it will make a big difference on, though, is the fact we're going to start doing deals in the UK again. Because virtually all of the investors that I have, which are largely family offices or small institutions, when they look at the UK, they just say there's too much risk. Even if it only goes wrong 20% of the time, on an individual deal, 20% is just too much risk to take.
I'd just be interested to get, as a final question, your view on what is happening with the global economy at the moment. Coronavirus is a feature of the landscape now that we're all trying to understand. The markets thus far outside China have not reacted that violently. But what is your perspective on how an event like this could change the narrative for the macroeconomic outlook for the global economy, which at the moment looks fairly mixed, could tip either way?
I don't think this particular virus, where it is today, could. However, the risk, which is what the Chinese have identified, is it could mutate. So if you take Spanish flu, 1919 to 1929, they talk about 50 million people, 5% of the world's population dying. That's one estimate. This isn't going to have an effect which is going to be infinitesimally less than that. So I don't think it will change. But the big fear is it could mutate into something which would be very, very different. And yes, I mean, plagues and pestilence are a risk and can. But at the moment, I think this one's not going to have a big effect. But
we'll see.
We'll see.